Anyway, here I am. I haven't done a video in 3 months, it looks like. Sorry about that. I've been really busy with work. Thank God. Right? So that's been great. Of course, while I haven't been here, I've still been pretty busy doing a lot of here I am, spiritual
I haven't done a video
style
in
work, right? So probably just a little update with some of that stuff. Like I've been involved with a lot of really interesting things this year. I think I mentioned this in the last video I did, but basically what happened was like back in January of this year, I guess I kind of made a decision that I was going to maybe put some focus into really learning a few different techniques. Uh, in particular, what I really started with was the key to the True Qabbalah, which is Frab Bardon's third book, which I know, but I hadn't really put the effort in uh, to really. I mean, I knew it intellectually, but not like as a process, right? I hadn't really put in the full effort that's needed to be a master of that domain, if you will, right? So that was kind of where I decided I was going to spend some time earlier this year, and uh, and I did, and it was really valuable. Really learned a lot from putting in the effort there. And part of that process was to take a few classes. So I did a few classes of Seu Mark Rasman, who's a Chi Gong teacher in Thailand, who's also an expert in the Frab Bardon methods, which was really interesting, helpful. In some ways, it was helpful. In some ways, lesser, not as much, but it was still useful. And then I decided also one of the other things is that most of my practice over these years has been obviously a bit focused, focused on me, right? And so I kind of decided to try and stretch out a little bit, and specifically with the idea of like more ceremonial aspects of everything. And that really started off with like doing fire pujas. So I spoke to a friend, David Fields, who I met in Pucallpa, who teaches Vedanta, and he gave me kind of like a guide on how to do that, and that was really a powerful experience, the puja, and that really got me thinking more about the ceremonial aspects. Got me thinking more about the ceremonial aspects of well, one of the sort of meditational space, and also that obviously there's like a there's like a blurry line there between meditational space and magic, right? And so that was really interesting. And I signed up for a class about which I think I talked about in the last video. It's been 3 months, so and the last class I did was on the Furba, which is the Tibetan ceremonial dagger, which is really powerful and really interesting. This device, which obviously what happens is you meditate on this, and there's a lot of visualizations which go along with it, which are really interesting. And then the last process I've been going through in the last number of months, this actually seems like a long time now, is I decided because the FERBA class was being run by Jason Miller, who's a well-known magician, right? He's written a bunch of books about it. And so he was also doing this class on Hecate, um, who I didn't really know much about Hecate, but I was doing a sadhana to Kali at one point, and all of a sudden I started seeing Hecate imagery everywhere. And so I just decided to like investigate it and just sort of go with the flow of what that of just of the imagery I started seeing. I figured, well, I'm just going to assume that's some kind of sign. So sign up for the class as an exploratory maneuver and see what happens. And it's been really, really interesting. Now, the Tibetan class, the Frab class, which is a Tibetan Buddhism class, was really, really interesting. But it did have a lot of Tibetan mantras, and I wasn't really able to keep up with it at the time. But I'm probably going to double back to that. Um, Maybe not to that specific class, but I'm in touch now with this Tibetan Lama who's in Argentina and who runs a group on Facebook called Tantric Sorcery Online. And Tantric Sorcery generally, I mean, sorcery sounds all hocus pocus, but this is basically magic for enlightenment, is what it comes down to in the tantric world. But he's got a programmed course, which I'll probably end up doing just because it's interesting. Plus, it's Argentina is pretty local, so that's I can fly to Buenos Aires in like in an hour or 2 hours probably with driving. So it's not that big a deal if I wanted to go over there or whatever. Plus, he comes to Chile quite a lot, so it's very convenient to have somebody. Plus, he's a really good teacher, so that's pretty cool. Um, anyway, the Hecate class has been it's been really, 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 really interesting. It's really opened my mind about a lot of stuff, and I was kind of iffy about the Hecate class because some people think that Hecate is a demon. That's not actually true. She's not a demon. Some people say she's in the first sphere of the Qliphoth. That's not true. I mean, dude, you can put anybody you want in any Sephiroth you want. It's like if I wanted to imagine that Gandalf's in my first chakra, you can do it and you can have an interesting experience. But that doesn't really mean that it works. Um, I'm going to start taking notes here quickly because what's going to happen is I'm going to go off on tangents here and I'll get lost and it will just be a mess. Um, what I just said there about imagining Gandalf in the first chakra is actually an interesting point. It's an interesting point because it corresponds with something else I want to talk about here, which is this light codes thing. Um, the thing is that there are ways of understanding consciousness which sometimes appear to work, but oftentimes are just not quite correct. So, for example, I've often spoken about using sensual or desire energy to move through the chakras, and that is wonderful and interesting practice, and I think it's valuable, right? I think it's a valuable practice, but that technique probably won't open the third eye chakra, for example, right? Using desire in the third eye chakra is like it's like imagining Gandalf in the root chakra. It's kind of like the wrong tool. No, it might work if you do it enough. Certainly, Robert Bruce always said things like, "Oh, he didn't use desire energy specifically, but he did spend hours and hours and hours and hours using energy meditation because he thought that was the right tool." And he did have success with some Kundalini awakening stuff. But my general vibe on this is you just need to find the right tool for the job. So part of my little process here has been discovering some of the right tools. So, for example, using desire energy in the third eye chakra can be ecstatic and valuable experience, but it may not be the right key. It may not be the right key. It may not be the right key for the job. The correct key for the job is represented by the two. I'm just going to have to check my notes here. Hold on a second here. The correct. I'm like, I always have to sort of check my nomenclature here, just so I don't sound like an idiot. But the correct way of working with the third eye chakra, well, one correct way might be contemplating the two Sanskrit letters Ham and Kasam. right? Which I'm not pronouncing properly. But those are the two Sanskrits associated with one petal and the other petal of, I think it's Ham and Sam here, right? And I'm sure you've heard people do this, and I know I've said this to people too, is that like I mean, lots of people teach this on YouTube, right? They teach about the Biha mantras, right? So they teach you how to like go Lam, Vam, Ram, Yam, Ham. Those are the Biha mantras of the chakras, right? And so the idea is if you just repeat those mantras while visualizing each chakra, that will enlighten you or whatever. I I think it may, but it's not going to work as such. It may work, right? I mean, there's always a chance you may just be destined to do that, but there's that. What it really means is you have to sort of contemplate, like you have to contemplate those things. And interestingly, Ham and Ksam. So Ksam is Ham is in ancient worlds, that might Ham would be more related with Shiva, and Gassam would be more related with Shakti, right? And so what we're talking about is you might think about it as the consciousness and the not the consciousness so much, but the like sort of the intellect and the intuition, right? So you get two streams of consciousness, or you might think of one of them as that kind of thing. But what happens is well, it's hard to explain what happens, but what happens is kind of like when you start contemplating. The thing is, when you start contemplating the difference between those letters, Sam represents intuition, and so what rather than meditating on desire, you meditate on what intuition is, right? That's what opens it up, and um, and it's really interesting because we tend not to hear the intuition because the other channel has got all the bandwidth. And so that's why the quieting of the mind is important because it almost takes it's all it's like you can hear something in the distance and you're like yeah and you just ignore it, but that's like it's the intuition is the actual they call it like in Spanish they call it the gotita. It's like the drop of wisdom from divinity. And so that's what you want to connect. Now this can be really stunning, right? So when I was doing this, that was yeah, it was a really shocking experience. What happens sometimes is when you open chakras up, the experience is so huge. It's I mean I say shocking. I mean literally your body goes into shock. You'll like start hyperventilating and shaking and like right, and it's a bit intense. So you have to have sort of like good breathing techniques to like maintain calm and keep your mind in a good state because it's incredibly powerful. Um, anyway, so this was the thing I was talking about using the right tool for the job, right? So this is the thing is you can use energy, and I still do that. I'll still use energy moving around the chakras, especially the third eye chakra, but like it's almost like it's almost like an appetizer before I move into the contemplation of the of what intuition means. And so what happens is when you start contemplating intuition, that becomes like a self-reflexive or a what's the word? I always forget the name of this word. Ruh, 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 ruh. I've been using ChatGPT a lot because it's such a great partner in meditation and many other things. But recursive, it's a recursive. So when you place consciousness onto a concept, such as especially concepts about consciousness, it becomes self-reflexive or recursive. And so recursive means it kind of loops around in itself. It's like having two mirrors facing each other, right? So you get two mirrors facing each other, and that becomes like an echo chamber. And that echo chamber produces what happens is the intention, because of the echo chamber, achieves the gain sufficient, right? It's like the amplitude of the intention becomes sufficient to penetrate through the particular layer of consciousness which you're approaching, right? So maybe your intention to do something isn't enough, but if you focus your intention in the right place, in a self-reflexive place, that creates this self-reflective mirrored recursive effect. And because it like boom, and that moves, it's like moving into like it's like crossing the sound barrier, right? So it's like oh, and you're oh, something happened, right? um anyway, I wasn't planning on talking about that later, but since I mentioned Gandalf in the root chakra, that was the kind of same concept. I was talking about the Hecate thing, I guess, and how the I got into this Hecate class, which has been really, really interesting because it's one thing is Jason Miller has spent he was in Tibet for 5 years studying Tibet, and when he was in a cemetery doing his Tibetan practice of contemplating the dead, a spirit came out to him in the cemetery, and it was the spirit of Hecate. And Hecate told him that he should work with her when he came back to the States. So that's what he did. And so his class is written in a way which is it's got a lot of Tibetan Tantra influence on it. And it's actually really cool because I was a bit like, do I want to study this goddess, who some people say is the demon of the first Saphiroth or the first Qliphoth sphere? And I wasn't really sure, but you know, I've seen a lot of crazy stuff in my life, and there's, and I did it. Part of this is you do it kind of like with the, it's almost like what they call that when you start meditating in Tibetan Buddhism. You do the initial prayer, right? You, you give thanks to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and so you do this with the intention of furthering consciousness, right? And actually understanding what the relationships actually are rather than, oh, I'm not going to do it because I'm fearful, right? So you say, okay, what actually is going on here? So the it's a very well written course. Now he's actually got three courses about Hecate. And the first one is so I'm in the first one. It's it's 7 months long. I think we're past halfway now, but it's very, very extensive. And just really, really interesting materials. And what's interesting about it is he connects meditational aspects with mantra aspects with ceremonial aspects, which feel very Tibetan. There are very sort of Tibetan ceremonial vibes, um, and offerings and evocations of other spirits. And interestingly, evocation of the dead and evocation of protector spirits like the Gorgons. And what is interesting is Hecate is really a divinity. She's a Greek divinity, right? She's kind of Greco-Romano, more Greek, with origins potentially in Babylon stuff. So kind of like Yahweh was kind of like a tribal desert god before he became the Lord God of all the world, right? So these deities often go through their own evolutions as they move through human consciousness, and before they become established in their own right. So that kind of happened to Hecate too when she was coming from the Babylonian vibe and then coming into like the Greek pantheon, where she most famously um, was involved in the recovery of Persephone from Hades. I believe Hades stole Persephone, took her down to the underworld, and Hecate went to the sun god, whose name eludes me right now, and she went to the sun god, and they were able to negotiate getting Persephone out of hell. So she's been this character who has occupied the imperial realms, Empyrean realms, because she has the ability to work with deities. She's is she the daughter of Zeus? No, she's the daughter of Perseus and I can't remember the name, but she has divine progenitors, and um and she's, well, they like to use the word liminal spaces. She's kind of like in between spaces, so she occupies these in between spaces. um and some people saw her as like the god of nature. Some people saw her as the god of the sky, and so she gained this sort of understanding that she was a triple goddess. She was the goddess of the sky, the earth, and the sea, right? And that's often represented with a symbol. Like there's various symbols, but one that might have like a full moon with two half moons on each side. Her face is often, her statues and art is often got one face, and then she's got three faces, right, representing. And sometimes those other faces have been known to be represented by other um, deities, right? So she's kind of like, it's kind of in the same way that Saraswati and uh, Parvati and Kali, for example, might form a triumvirate deity or a tri deity. So she's got the same kind of thing going on there. Like she was like the Selene is the moon deity in Greece. So there was like three of them who were kind of related, and sometimes she was combined with those three. But in this course, she's being dealt with as Hecate proper with three aspects. Um, so but there's been some really interesting things just in terms of the connection with ceremony in particular, which um, which is based on offerings, which I've never really done before. So that's been an interesting process, and then the evocation of other spirits, in particular the Gorgons, which was quite interesting, who are evoked as defensive spirits, as well as other ones. The Graces, who were the three daughters of Zeus, they're evoked, and the Greys were the three spirits with the one eye, which they used to do divination. So there's a whole bunch of these sort of tri-spirit groups who are evoked into the astral temple, which is built. So the whole thing is really interesting. Um, and then of course, like he's got two other courses. He's got another like two other 6 month courses based on this material, which get way deeper into it. And it's already really deep. It's really He's done an amazing job putting this together. It's just unbelievable. And it's clearly yeah, for the most part, is a very well informed material. The material is clearly coming from Hecate, and he's clearly editing it, but it's authentic material, and it's really interesting too, just to sort of explore that sort of Greek pantheon a bit, right? So there's a lot of really interesting things. So, for example, some of you may remember I did a video years ago about the birth of Ganesha. So Ganesha, for example, was born um, when Shiva and Parvati, they or I can't remember the story, but it was like Parvati, I think, had a baby. Shiva was upset and cut his head off, and then they were so angry that he had to bring it back to life, and they couldn't find the head, so they put an elephant's head on it, right? And so there's this kind of like crazy birth story. And so what happens is that's like a metaphorical story, but it actually represents like it represents a transformation of consciousness, which can be contemplated. And similarly, similar things happen in the Greek myths. For example, the Gorgons, who are horrifying, they're so horrifyingly ugly that if you look at them, you turn to stone. Of course, Medusa, there was three Gorgons. There was Stethos, Medusa, and oh, I'm sorry, you guys, forgot the other name. But there was three of them. But Medusa was the only, yeah. But well, Medusa. What happened with Medusa is she was originally very beautiful, but she pissed off Hera, I think it was. One of the gods made love with her and pissed off one of the goddesses. So the goddess made her horribly ugly. So Medusa is sometimes seen as a kind of representation for, like the woman's rights or something because she was punished for beauty, right? But what's interesting about that too is that when Medusa is slain, right? Because I can't remember, is it Perseus or somebody comes along and like cuts her head off? But when they cut her head off, of course, I'd forgotten all this stuff. But when the blood of the Gorgon, when the blood of Medusa hits the ground, it turns into Pegasus, the winged horse. So there's all these like really beautiful symbolic acts which are really worth contemplating because these are ancient myths which are trying to represent transformations of consciousness. And so what's really interesting about this class is it's representing or is presenting a lot of these myths, but they're actually in sort of an active form. They're in an active contemplative form, which it becomes really fun and sort of interesting to sort of because you get a little bit like skeptical, like should I be like meditating on the Gorgons? I mean, they're evil, right? Right, but then that provokes a sort of investigation, which is really interesting, and it actually yields some really beautiful material. And so this has happened quite a few times, like meditating on Hecate, who's purportedly of a neutral nature, right? Is she good? Is she bad? Or is she both, right? But more than once, meditating on Hecate will it just create this unbelievable vibration, just like whoa, just astonishing beauty emanating from the vibrational character, which is far from evil, right? Because evil has a particular signature to it. And I think in a lot of ways that signature can be provoked in any meditation, in any deity. A lot of it's coming from the intention of how you go there, right? How do you approach the meditation? Which, the classic example of this is 10 years ago when I was trying to do the banishing ritual of the pentagram and I was evoking demons. And it's supposed to eliminate demons, but it all depends on how you approach it, right? It's like, what are your presuppositions, right? So, yeah, that's part of it too. Um, so the whole thing, really, really, really interesting, you guys. Recommend the course. But like again, it is a bit of work, and you've got to do a ceremony every single day, which I've been doing. It's actually, yeah, I got to do one in about 30 minutes here. So you do the ceremony, and every week the ceremony gets a little bit more involved and a little bit more interesting, and then yeah, just some really really cool stuff. So one of the things is Hecate, in this course at least, has got a bunch of like associated symbols. So, for example, if you look at like statues of Ganesh, he has got various um, tools or objects in his hands. I can't remember what they all are, but one of them is a goad, and the goad is like I guess is what you use to like uh, push like to hit the cattle so they move. That doesn't sound very spiritual, but apparently what that means is he's using that to guide you towards enlightenment, right? So you get these tools which have like specific enlightenment references. So Hecate's got that too. So one of her tools is the key, right? So she's known as what was it, Clédouche. She has a lot of like epithets. She's got a lot of names associated with her. So this is, I guess, this is quite common in evocation. And I guess, I've came up with my own technique of evocation. Whereas, like often when I want to evoke a spirit, I'll think about the spirit and then I'll just focus on particular aspects. So, for example, if I want to evoke the Virgin Mary, I'll bring an image of the Virgin Mary into my mind, and then I might zoom in onto like for some reason the eyes are really effective. So if I zoom in on her eyes and just really start visualizing fine details like the eyelashes, how the eyelashes connect, and then it's like this sort of, and there's a sort of loving dotage to it because part of it is like the imaginative the imaginative construct becomes so fascinating. It's like, well, how would that connect? And you start sort of being curious about that, and that interest is what does it. And in the context of Hecate, that's kind of like my technique, I guess, the way I do it. But in the way, like I guess the standard evocation technique is, it's kind of similar. Whereas I'll focus on sort of physical details because I can see that very clearly. But I think in like standard evocation, what you'll do is you'll use epithets. So you might say, "Great Zeus, finest, most strongest Zeus," or whoever complimentary things you might think of. And so Hecate's got a bunch of these epithets like Clédouche, which I think is this like means key holder, right? She's got like 20 of them. And so you repeat these as a way of like evoking the presence. And the key is to unlock different layers of consciousness, right? Um, which is really has been interesting. As I mentioned, I've had some sort of interesting. It's been generally there hasn't been huge evocations. I mean, I've had some vibes and I've had some light evocations. Certainly nothing like sort of like what I do when I personally evoke a spirit. But that's probably too because I'm kind of like what is the vibe here? It's just sort of a more of a curiosity because it's like it's such a different pantheon that I'm used to. Um, but overall, the connection between ceremony and implements and tools and mantras, because there's a quite a few mantras associated with this. There's mantras for the evocation of Hecate and for guardians and for the Gorgons, and all of them have their own mantras, which and there's a whole bunch of things which all kind of work together. So what's really interesting about it, of course, it's a complete sort of system, or as he calls it, an arcanum. It's a complete arcanum, right? Which is really interesting to see that kind of thing developed. So clearly, he doesn't want anybody else to teach this. This is a big bread and butter thing for him. Plus, it's basically coming from his formed relationship with Hecate, but really, really valuable material. I really recommend the class. If you're if you're into that kind of thing. And so yeah, so I'll probably, if I ever do any classes again, I'll probably use some of these ideas because it's been so fascinating to see how he structured it, and the whole idea of the building the astral temple is such a valuable concept, and it's really easy to do it. And I remember reading about some lady years ago who had written a book about building an Egyptian astral temple and evoking Isis and all this kind of stuff. And I was thinking, like, how do you do that? Like you're like you're having to like mortar. You bring in like mortar mentally and bricks. No, yeah, you just visualize that the temple is ready, right? It's ready. The important part of it is the relationships and the spirits which you evoke in the temple, and also the guardians. So this concept of guardians is used in pretty much everything, right? I mean, this is used in it's used in Buddhism and Tantra. Um, It's certainly used in Western esoteric magic, and it's probably used in Christianity too, but in a more subtle way, right? They won't talk about it like that, but that's basically what it is, right? So there's evocations of guardians, and yeah, the whole thing's really fascinating. Of course, yeah. So I haven't done any videos here for a while because I've been so unbelievably busy with work, plus with all this stuff. And like, yeah, I get so much stuff going on, like with spirituality and stuff. So I'm doing another course in Tibetan Buddhism right now too, which is run by the Lama in Tibet. Or no, he's not in Tibet. He's in Argentina. The Tibetan Lama. He's an Argentinian Lama who lives in Argentina, but he spent time in Tibet. There you go. And he's got a course which I've been doing too, which is really beautiful course, which basically just has some really beautiful ceremonies evoking various bodhisattvas and deities in a very beautiful way, with the intentions of they've got sort of, some of them have got sort of worldly, some of it's got worldly intentions. Like, let me just have a quick look here. So there's rituals for long life and healing, rituals for blessings and purifications, rituals for protection, rituals for insight and memory, and rituals for enrichment. But these are all kind of done under the sort of rubric of, okay, we're trying to become enlightened, kind of a thing. But really cool. Um, I have a drink here. So yeah. So yeah, so I've had some insights, obviously, with a lot of this stuff. I've had some funny experiences. I had an experience last week where I was evoking the dead, which yeah, I've had a couple of experiences lately with with I'll mention this just because the title here is Light Codes. Um, there's a guy, as you know, this channel started off like when I was doing ayahuasca and plant medicines, right? Which I don't really do anymore. I mean, I've got tobacco here and stuff. I do break out. Oh, I broke out tobacco last week actually during this story, which I'm about to tell you about. So I was, but generally I don't really do any essences or anything. But 2 weeks ago, I was on Instagram and I suddenly got like just on my feed, some guy, local guy, a local light worker who has an essence, and it's some kind of essence to open the subtle planes. Oh, that's interesting. I was looking at it. I'm like, yeah, what's that all about? You know, so I'm looking at this essence, and there's a lot of like local people, like, because there's a quite a big spiritual community here, like sort of New Age or witches and sort of psychics, all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of that here, you know. And a lot of people in the community were like, wow, this is crazy. So I thought, screw it, you know. So I got in touch with the guy. I'm like, yeah, what is this? I'm like, and people are saying, dude, what is this, LSD or something? He's like, no, no. He's like, it's just symbols, like symbols. So apparently, the story about this guy is he used to make the Bach flowers. You know the Bach flower essences. They're really light, and they often use them for kids just to like align them without taking Prozac kind of thing, right? And so this guy was he used to do that, but he decided to start. He's like a light worker, and he's very advanced, and he'd been working with what's that thing that Jesus was involved in, the Essenes. So there's a woman here who teaches a lot of the Essene teachings, and he'd been working with her, and he decided to do an essence which has nothing in it except light symbols. I'm calling it light codes. He didn't call it light codes. He just said light symbols. This is, I guess, that's the same thing, right? So he was using, and I was like, it's like Reiki. You're putting Reiki into the essence, right? And he's like, oh, it's not really Reiki. So it's not Reiki symbols. It's other kinds of symbols, right? So I thought, what the hell? So I got some, and yeah, so I took some. And I'm like, oh, this is LSD, right? This is like, yeah. So I just took one drop, and I'm like, oh, it's acid, right? And then so I got touched with it. I'm like, dude, this is, I'm like, it's great. It's acid. I just want to know if it's acid. I just want to know because it's like I need to be really careful because I don't want to storm the gates of heaven, right? Because I'm already wide open. I got to be really careful with whatever I consume. And he's like, dude, take it to the lab. He's like, there's nothing in it. He's like, all it is light. And so we ended up in a big chat about it. So he's really deep into this whole thing, and he was explaining how he structured the codes. There's like 3 layers of codes. One of them's for opening you up, one of them's for purification, and one of them's for, what's the other one for? Connecting with higher self. There's a bunch of layers, but yeah, you feel the layers. And so yeah, so I had some big experiences. So the first big experience I had that was I was meditating on the dad like a week ago. And so part of meditating the dad, you're not just trying to like visualize scary dead people, you're actually starting with your ancestors. So part of Jason Miller's, and not just his, because he's getting his information from like Tibetan stuff, is like local spirits and ancestors are very important. So a lot of times people, for example, you get all these people on YouTube talking about manifestation. They're like, how am I going to manifest? Just like I saw some woman on YouTube last week saying, just imagine. What she was doing, like the classic affirmation, like I money comes easily to me. Money comes easily to me, and I feel like there's gold in my pockets, right? But you have to say it in a way where you believe it, right? So Jason Miller's vibe on this is that that may work, but like if you really want to see changes in your life, you need to contact your ancestors and the local spirits because they're probably all pissed at you. Cause, well, maybe not pissed at you, but you're so out of touch with like actual reality that's going on around you. And so if you actually take the time to contemplate and venerate your ancestors and this kind of thing, then your whole life will change just based on those practices, just based on that, right? And so part of the practice for that week was just sort of going through. So you start thinking about like, okay, your grandparents, for example, and you start contemplating. You might start thinking about them, then you just contemplate them. So you're trying to find this place where it's sort of recursive. You're trying to find the two mirror place where you get this place where it's a contemplative space where you can just sit and it's sort of it's just moving by itself. And dude, there's a really interesting quote. Let me see if I can find this on my telephone here. There's a really, really good quote, which I'm reading this book right now, which is called Spectrum of Ecstasy, which is written by this woman who was on the Guru Viking podcast about a month ago. Her name's Kandro or something. But this book, Spectrum of Ecstasy, is brilliant. It's really good. As you know, I talk a lot about the elements, right? Like that's why I talk a lot about the elements, man, right? And I mean, it's pretty much a huge part of my meditational life and also like just my daily life because what tends to happen to me now is my consciousness is so open that I see this stuff all the time. So like I'll be driving the kids to school and I can see the interplay of elements in various levels, right? And it's like you're like, wow. And I just started laughing because it's like, how is that even possible that I can see this shit? It's crazy, dude. Right? Um, but there was a really good. Do I have this saved? Let me just see if I've got it in my YouTube here because it relates to this. It relates to this idea of um, of the self-reflexivity of consciousness because it doesn't just work. It doesn't just work with positive things. It also works with negative things, and it's really important. For example, I've been posting this stuff left and right on the here it is. So on the community page of the YouTube here It's one of the first posts. It's an image post. It's called Blue Candle Power Display. Listen to this. The process of artificially maintaining and intensifying emotional pain with thought is gyroscopic. What does gyroscopic means? It almost means, it doesn't quite mean this, but it means like it's almost self-reflexive. It's kind of like spinning on itself, right? If we keep a cycle of thought constantly spinning, we generate a charge that actively prevents the dissipation of pain, right? So the process, what happens is people consciousness, and I've mentioned this years ago, but consciousness almost, if you have spinning consciousness, it creates friction. Now, obviously, it's not real friction from the real world. It creates a tertiary energy, right? That's what they're saying here. The cycle of thought spinning will generate a charge that prevents the dissipation of pain. So what they're talking about here is they're talking about this in a negative context. Like you will allow your mind to get caught up in these self-reflective contemplations about shitty stuff in your life, right? Like, oh fuck, I can't pay my bills. Oh God, or God damn that, you know, that, whatever problem you got in your love life, right? And you keep repeating it and you're repeating it like, oh my, what the fuck? You're right, yeah, da 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 da. And so that constant gyroscopation or self-reflexive mirroring creates friction, a tertiary, a tertiary energy form. Now, in the case of this quote here, that tertiary energy form is used to hold the conscious structure in place. So it feels like you can't break out of the problem that you're in. So for example, if you're stuck in a difficult mental state, that stuckness is creating more stuckness. And so the only way you can really get out of that is you have to sort of contemplate it in a different way. Um, it's interesting though, because that consciousness, self-reflexive consciousness creates tertiary forces. And again, sometimes what's interesting about that is those forces. Now, in the real world, we can say, okay, if I circle my hand with a nylon cloth around a plastic table, I'll generate an electric charge, right? And we know that's physics. Now, in consciousness, it's distinct because consciousness has all kinds of other things. It's got everything associated with it. So it can also generate visual material, right? It can generate visual material. It can generate karmic material. Like, I mean, who knows what's going on there? I kind of lost my train of thought because I was trying to find that book reference. Um, what was I talking about previously? Well, I can't remember where I was at there, but this idea of it's really interesting. And I think there's a relationship there too. Like for me, that tertiary energy, that to me is akin to the blood which creates Pegasus, right? So what we've got there is you've got, I mean, what happens in the myth of Medusa is there's a mythical event, the decapitation with a sword, and that creates an energy, right? But I mean, you could look at that like the magical entrapment of Medusa by Hera, I think it's Hera. Um, that is kind of a sort of cyclical magical loop, right? And to break that, that creates this. There's a relationship there. I may not be all super direct here, so I'm really I'm pushing it a little bit, but there's something there. There's something there to that relationship. It's not super direct, but it is related. Um, yeah, so I lost my train of thought completely. I'm totally lost. But that book, dude, the what's it called? I'm here talking about it. I forgot the name of the book. It's Ecstasy. It's called. I've got to open. Hold on, let me just find it. It's called Spectrum of Ecstasy: The Five Wisdom Emotions. Really, really good book. And she's written a bunch of books. And she's also on the Guru Viking podcast. And so that was where I saw her. And she has a really interesting story. She was on there and she'd mentioned that she'd been studying Buddhism but hadn't really connected that much, but she was still trying. And then this Tibetan Lama came and he was like, listen, he's like, he's like, I want to do a tour around the United States. Why don't you help me organize it? And she was like, okay, that's weird. So she helped them organize and they went on tour and stuff. And then after a few months, he said to her he'd had visions of her in Tibet and she was going to be his consort. And she's like, what? Because she was a nun. And she's like, I'm not going to be your consort. But she ended up moving to Tibet and becoming his consort and becoming enlightened, I guess. So when I was listening to her, it was clear that she wasn't full of shit. You know, it was like, oh, she actually. So I decided to go look up her books, and that book, Spectrum of Ecstasy, has got a really good exploration of the elements. And what's nice about it is it's got a good varied writing style. Some of the writing has got sort of dialogical. It's kind of like back and forth between two people. It's almost like it's been transcribed in a chat. So that makes it quite easy reading. But then there's other parts which get really deep into the analysis. But it's all done in a way of it's all done in a very easy to read way. But the analysis into like how elements work is something I've seen. So like she talks about stuff, I'm like, oh man, this is so great to get the validation like from a lama, you know. I think with the Kundalini opens up knowledge, which yeah, which you know, like I really shouldn't have access to this stuff probably because like I see a lot of this stuff. And so if I read a book, I can see the truths in it and stuff, right? You say it's obvious and it all just emerges. But it's not because I got any particular talent. It's just a Kundalini side effect. Like the Kundalini pushes into things. Um, oh yeah, I remember. So I was talking about the dad, right? I was talking about the dad and how I was using this essence, right? And so yeah, there you go, back to normal. So I'd been using this essence, which is called, I've got it here. It's called Planos Sutiles Formula Uno, Nuestra Verdadero Esencias. Ta-da. And you can see, I don't know if you can see it, but I've hardly used any of this, but really, really powerful. Anyway, when I was using this, I was contemplating the the ancestors. So I was trying to get into this space of the self the self-reflective space of the ancestors. And so you think about like your grandparents, and then you'll move back, and then you'll move into the next like your great grandparents, and you're like, wait a minute, there's uncles who've died and other people have died, and you're like, oh, I remember that guy. Then there's all these myths from my mother's side of the family, like there was like five great uncles who all died in the war, right? Uncle Robert, he was shot in Italy and lost his leg, but it's interesting because he went back. I think they gave him like a fake leg, and he walked back out onto the battle, you know, because he wasn't going to be stopped from fighting the Germans or so he went back out and then he was killed. And it's funny because that's like one of the family myths. And then you're like, as you're meditating, you're realizing, dude, that never happened. That was what the CO told the family, right? Because they don't want to tell your sons that. So they tell your son actually was heroic, right? He was ready to fight and die for the queen, right? And so that's what happened. Then there's Uncle Lackey who went to Alaska, he wrote a letter home, and he'd found his fortune in gold. Then he vanished, never to be heard from again. Right? There was another guy got blown up he was an engineer in one of the big boats, and it blew up in the New York harbor, and he died there. All these, so you think about all these ancestors, all these myths, family myths, right? And then you start sort of like, okay, there's family myths, then there's Greek myths, and then there's religious myths, and there's this sort of whole sort of family pantheon who never get contemplated generally. And so you get into this self-reflexive space. Yeah, anyway, so I taken this essence and all of a sudden shit got way too real, dude. It got like, woof, it got really, yeah, it got out of hand. Things became incredibly like communicating with the actual spirits and and then like pushing through pushing through the third eye. Yeah, really, really interesting. So, the funny thing is these essences and even plants and ayahuasca, but in some ways, like Bach flowers, sacred true essences, master plant dietas, and inert essences embedded with light codes. They've all got this sort of, they've all got the ability to function as pivots. Or it's almost like if you have a, if you have got a cycle, a pernicious cycle of thoughts which you cannot break, right? Imagine there's like a cyclical thing. Those essences interrupt. They have the ability to interrupt. Um, that's the sort of energy. They have the ability to interrupt the self-created energy of the thought structure, and by doing that, it allows you to sort of release it temporarily, but then gain a sort of understanding of how the process works. So then when you come back to meditation again, it allows you sort of like, wait a minute, like I've got a better understanding of this now. And maybe you can work more intuitively, right? And you're thinking, okay, let's just um, let's just work on this in a different way. Um, so that's about an hour of chatting here. I've been really wanting to do a video for a while, but then it's like I keep thinking I need to do like videos which are more structured, but then it's like who's got the time? I don't have the time right now. I've literally been cranking on work for months. I got a job in last February and it's still going on, thankfully. And then, other jobs come in and stuff, so it's been really busy. But luckily, I've been able to keep focused and do my meditational practice every day. And plus, yeah, on a personal note, just plus stuff with the family, kids and running around. So life got really, really, really busy, so which has been great. So everything's really cool, really chilled out here. Um, and when I can, I'll return and just do little updates. I've got a lot of well, I haven't really planned it yet, but this whole year has been astonishing in spiritual development. I really thought back in January when I was thinking, okay, I'll just do those. I'm just gonna get really into the oh, I'm not. I'm closing up the chat here, but I want to say this one more thing. Is yeah, this is important actually. Let me just go back to this quote on the YouTube, right? The process of artificially maintaining and intensifying emotional pain with thought is gyroscopic. If we keep a cycle of thought constantly spinning, we generate a charge that actively presents the dissipation of pain. Um, but without conceptualization, emotional pain becomes pure sensation. And it's released to dance in the vastness of the open dimensions of experience. Without the straitjacket of concept, pain ceases to be pain and becomes a free and ecstatic energy. Now, what they're describing there